your presentations. It's good to hear about the strong, firm foundation, both as a community and as a business, with how cannabis has been normalized when you have conversation with the people in your community. And I think it's what I would think I would want from my community, which is a reserve up north. But because of the colonizations that we went through and the trauma that we went through, First Nations are not in a position to be in a strong position like yours, like your town. And so when there's increased poverty, you said there's increased addictions, and there's a lot of addictions in First Nations communities. So for many of the youth that use marijuana, it's a social issue that has become criminalized. There's a lot of youth that are incarcerated in juvenile detention centers, and many of them from marijuana use. I've spoken to Gordon Cruz. He's worked with them 30 to 40 years. And in the next 4 years, 11,000 will be coming out, children in care. 9,000 will be indigenous, and this is in Manitoba alone. So my question is for Mr. Rewak. When you look at the amendment that you had proposed on punishment for an individual who's 18 years and older, and if they're guilty, that you're proposing an term of imprisonment of not more than 14 years. When is that here?
We're not proposing that.
Okay. What is this? That's what concerned me.
In the amendments?
In the amendment, yeah.
That would be really for large-scale commercial operations. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves. We still live in a racialized society, and there is disparate and disproportionate impact on Canadians who are visible minorities, and First Nations populations in particular have faced generations of abuse and at times mistreatment. This will be defined in regulations, and to be very clear, we're not looking at that for some kids who make a mistake. I'm talking about a large-scale commercial operation, and that would be clarified in the regulatory development under this act. My objectives in this industry, I work for a not-for-profit. I have no stock options. I'm not here to make money. I'm here because this is the most exciting social industry in generations. We are counterintuitively investing in communities that need economic development, and we're taking something that has for generations unfairly targeted elements of our population into the sunlight, and we're taking a criminal element out of it. This is positive for our society. I will not be involved in this, and I will not advocate for punishments for children at an unfair level or for youth in that regard. Instead, I would encourage the tax revenues generated from this nascent industry to be used for education and development in those same communities.
Okay.
Just to clarify this document that you've presented, the parts that are shaded are what you're proposing as amendment. The rest of it that you see there is the government's bill.
Yes.
Okay.
But I still want to clarify,
yours-
that component must be defined in regulations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. One more question.
Yes.
Okay. You had mentioned that smoking was one of the best prevention. The preventive methods against smoking was one of the most successful, but not in low-income or First Nations communities because of their social determinants of health. And so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how we can approach a public health program through smoking, when to address the smoking, to address addictions, because it's been very difficult for me to try and find a way to address this with First Nations. And yeah, it's...
I would be happy to speak with that. As Minister, we work very closely, and as you may know, the First Nations Health Authority was formed in British Columbia,
Yeah.
where we have a health system designed and administered by First Nations. And we had a very extensive smoking cessation program that was available to all British Columbians that we were very proud of. It drove down smoking rates to the lowest rates ever. But further to what Mr. Linton said about this industry and the ability to do research on some very novel approaches to addictions medicine is very exciting. The BC Centre for Substance Use is doing some very good work on looking at cannabis as an exit drug for people that are dependent on opioids, for instance, or other hard substances like crack cocaine. Cannabis may, in fact, be part of the armamentarium for addiction specialists to get them off of those harder drugs. There's also a lot of interesting research going on in CBD, which is the component, the other major cannabinoid in cannabis that doesn't give you that high. It has effects on the nervous system, but it doesn't give you that high. And there are some very exciting research going on in terms of using CBD for mental health disorders and for addictions. It interacts with the body's endocannabinoid system to kind of bring you back into homeostasis. Mm-hmm. And so there may be some very good research that comes from this legalization and the innovation that will be spurred by this that will actually help people with addictions across Canada and the world.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. That completes round one. Before I go to round two, I'd like to ask our panelists about packaging. We heard from some people yesterday on that very issue, and you, Mr. Linton, said in your comments that people will want choice. Well, how will they identify the choice is one issue, and the proposed regulations from Health Canada, as they are at this point, drafted to this point in time, have laid out a pretty clear path in terms of what kind of labeling will be put on the packaging. So I wonder what your thoughts are about all of that, and whether you think that's reasonable for the industry, or there's some changes that you think need to be made. I'll start with Mr. Linton.
Sure. So in other forums, I've often expressed that my primary competitor is branded and it's called Ziploc, right? They're baggies. And so really what I think we want to do is migrate them from that standard of packaging and decision making to one which gives them information so that when they walk into a spot, which is already age restricted, right? We're not talking about packaging sitting where youth are. This is an age restricted environment that people should have at least a visual cue as to which corporations have produced it and which products they can select, because they're not all the same. I'm not looking to see that it becomes a 12-color hippy-dippy shiny thing, but I do think there should be ability to make an informed decision, and we are really trying to bring people into a controlled environment for that. Where we are now, the data we have to present on the package informs the size of the package more than what people would want to buy. And what I mean by that is, in order to create a small package with a small quantity, you have no room for the labeling with all of the warnings. And I'm not trying to get past them. I'm saying there's got to be a bit more practicality. Could we endure them as they are? Sure. Could they be improved? Yes. Will they be? I expect so.
What I just throw another question before others answer, and that is a lot of the commentary here at our meetings has centered around doing something similar to tobacco, which is highly restrictive, but particularly with the new regulations out of Bill S5. Is that going too far in your opinion? Any of you want to?
Yeah, I would be happy. I'd be happy. I mean, I'm an ardent anti-smoker. But as I was watching the committee online last night, enjoying a cold glass of Sauvignon Blanc, which had a label on it, which told me where it was from, how much alcohol was in it, you know, what I could expect from the flavor. And I listened to Senator Dean, who made a very good point about an age-restricted environment where people make a conscious decision to enter because they have a purpose, either to get information or to buy some cannabis. And to provide consumers with information to make them understand what they're buying and the effects it will have on their body, I think the packaging, the labeling is restrictive. But I also come from government, and I know that governments like to start conservatively, and once they get comfortable, the public gets comfortable, then things will loosen up. So I suspect that will happen. I'm with Mr. Linton. I don't believe we should be marketing the way alcohol is marketed, but you can't get that genie back in the bottle. But I do think that to compare us to tobacco is, well, if you look at the evidence, just not correct. In terms of the health impacts of tobacco versus cannabis, particularly as more and more people go to non-smoked forms of cannabis, then I think the comparisons are not really valid, and I think consumers need choice. As a former environment minister, I would say that the packaging is going to create an environmental situation that all of us will have to deal with. And again, as we get more comfortable with this, and we know that we can manage this in a way that is has less of an environmental impact, I think we will move in that direction as well.
Mr. Rewak, you have anything to add?
There's 2 points I think I'd like to make just in response to that. The first is both alcohol and tobacco are recognized as Class 1 carcinogens by the World Health Organization. Cannabis is not. Cannabis in combustible form, many of you heard Dr. Mark Ware speak at a breakfast a few weeks ago where he said, based on his review, the only direct linkage for health from combustion of cannabis is increased risk of bronchial infections. And that subsides when use subsides. So I think the risk factors are very different, and that obviously changes the way the product should be packaged. That being said, I concur that we do need restrictive packaging, but we should have some greater degree of informational and brand differentiation. And the reason is this is not a new market. If no Canadian consumed cannabis, I couldn't ethically and in clear conscience come to you and say plain packaging was a bad idea. But you might have figured out walking down the street a lot of people are consuming cannabis in Canada today. And our mission is not to bring new users into the marketplace. I don't want new users coming into the marketplace. I want to migrate illegal consumers to a legal marketplace. And to do that, we need to be able to have a dialogue with people at a retail who are adults in an age-gated environment simply about what they're buying.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll go into round 2. Senator Seidman.
I think probably I'm not going to engage in this conversation because we did hear the genie out of the bottle expression, Dr. Lake, yesterday, but you heard it, I'm sure. It was because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in the bottle. So the plea that we heard yesterday from scientific medical experts was that we should be more restrictive at the outset on packaging and advertising and marketing, and then see how it goes. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. That was the expression. Okay. Actually, Dr. Lake, I would like to ask you a question. On the website of Hydro Apothecary, it states that the health and safety of our clients is very important to us. And we've heard testimony here from many witnesses, for example, that the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse, that Canadians really don't understand the potential health harms of cannabis use. And the fact that it's being legalized makes them less concerned about the health harms. So, being a former Minister of Health, I'm sure you're concerned, as we are, about the health and well-being of Canadians, especially of young people. So I'd like to know what actions your company is taking to ensure that youth are aware of the adverse health effects of marijuana. Your company, has it undertaken any public education awareness campaigns to educate young Canadians of the risks associated with using recreational marijuana, and why or why not?
Not to this point, because we are today a medical cannabis company, and so obviously all of our current patients have a doctor or a nurse practitioner that is guiding their care, and so they certainly understand, or should understand, the impacts of the medication they're taking on them. As we move forward, of course, we want to support institutions, organizations that will convey those messages to youth. My daughter actually is a strategic advisor to the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. They've developed a toolkit that talks about how to talk to young people about cannabis. I met recently with Dr. Patricia Conrad, who is a psychiatrist at University of Montreal, and she has developed a program called Preventure, which basically allows educators to be trained to recognize traits in students that may make them more susceptible to substance use, and then help address and provide them with tools that would provide them with resilience. So we certainly want to support organizations and research in that regard.
Okay, when you say support, does that mean that your corporation and yours, Mr. Linton, would be putting aside a budget? In other words, like all companies should do for R&D? Would you be putting aside a budget for education?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And Bruce will speak to, because he's the big dog, he's got a very large social responsibility fund. But we certainly will be putting, my budget for corporate social responsibility is well over $1 million. We have been waiting for the Quebec government to pass their legislation. We want to honor the spirit of Bill 157 and wait until it's passed before we start rolling these things out, because they're in the middle of debating the bill, and we don't want to get in the way of that debate. But certainly that is our intention. So I'll let Bruce speak to what they're doing.
Well, and actually, the conversation enables us to spend our budget, which probably sounds remarkable, but it was very challenging even 3 years ago to have organizations accept capital on an unrestricted basis from us. And you say, really? No, Mothers Against Drug Driving was a 1-year conversation before we could actually give them a check on an unrestricted basis to expend to whatever campaign they felt was prudent. And it's because I think the whole dialogue around cannabis and management of it was not there. And so it feels today that it's changed dramatically over the last year. And, you mentioned at least one of the organizations that we were happy to have. Again, you provide the capital and you don't provide the guidance because the experts should do it. So I think you mentioned, is it your daughter? Yes. That's involved with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We were happy to again on that occasion. So I think you'll see it's good for business.
Right, except as we all know, those of us who work in the research area, that when we're supported by certain corporations, like in the pharmaceutical industry, there are conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. So how would your companies deal with something like that?
So our CSR approach is it is a blind, undirected check. You spend it as an organization. And I know that there's always a conflict in how far can you go, but I would think that over the next 5 years you're going to find that the management of the message and being sure education occurs is the priority more than manipulating the market and trying to do the pharmaceutical jig. I think we're in good territory for at least the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you. Senator Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Which happens way too often that I have the same idea on the question. So maybe, do we have a percentage on that kind of investment that you're planning to do on education and awareness? I know some corporation, they commit to a percentage on this is how much we're going to, how much of the revenue generated, we have this percentage that we commit to give back. So do you have something that is quantifiable like that?
We've been working on looking at a couple of percent, 2 to 3%. Part of it becomes, if it's entirely restricted, that when we provide our capital, our logo can't even be presented at the findings or the outcome of if they generated an ad campaign as a, Mothers Against Driving. If we can't be visible as a brewer would be, as a sponsor, it starts to curtail that. So I think we're struggling where some of the provinces are actually looking to eliminate all visibility of the existence of cannabis companies. I'm not sure that's the best route to getting a maximized CSR budget, and there's a little balance there. So I would expect you'll find the 2-3% can be there, but we need to have that balance.
Okay, and I also have another question for you, Mr. Linton, because Mr. Rewak, you just mentioned just now that the goal of your organization is not to attract new user, but you want to migrate, if I understood correctly, you want to migrate, the illicit market user to legitimate market, is how I see it. So I want to hear you, Mr. Linton, on that, especially in the context that I believe you just applied not long ago to be in the New York Stock Exchange. So I'm wondering, how you, as a business person, so how you articulate that kind of commitment from the organization to stockholders, for example, that you don't want to grow a new user market. And so
I would, to be truthful, I expect the market for medical to continue to grow and grow dramatically. And
Okay.
and on what basis? Well, benzodiazepines as sleep aids and some of the other ketamine approaches are very unsuitable for humans, but they're the best choices. So I expect to grow the medical market. I think that you're going to see a migration in 2 or 3 years when the format is permissible to be in a beverage format, where people will reduce the selection of alcohol and choose beverages which do not have the same drug-on-drug interaction profile, do not have the same calorific content. So I do, in fact, think you will see a transition from other markets, not just the black market, but from alcohol markets. And I think that there's going to be a health benefit and there's going to be a business benefit, but I wouldn't be truthful if I said I expect it only to be the black market transitions. That's not going to be the case over time for medical or rec.
okay, thank you.
I think Mr. Rewak.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I'd like to add some clarity to my statement. When I speak of migration, I'm speaking of adult consumer use, consumers of cannabis, not medical patients, and I'm speaking
Yes, yes.
specifically to the recreational side of C45.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Poirier.
Actually, I'm still along the line of my two colleagues here. That's where my questioning was going. So I'm going to continue expanding on that. And I hope I'm going to remember my thoughts right. But last week or the week before, when we had the Minister of Health from New Brunswick, Minister Benoit Book here in New Brunswick, and I questioned him, if I remember right, on the amount of money that they were investing into education, specifically to our youth and in schools, and in training our parents so that they know the risk of marijuana for the people under 25. And he mentioned to me at the time that they were going to start an investment, but they were actually just starting it here now in April. But I thought he told me, if I'm not mistaken, that there was also industry was going to be helping out financially with the education, which is what we're talking about. So I guess my question is, when we're talking about industry, are we talking about the industry that is growing the product, which your companies are doing, or are we talking about industry that's going to be selling the product, which is in the stores? And if it is the industry on the growing product, when you get a license to be in a province like New Brunswick or wherever you're working, is there any negotiation at that point to get the license that's made between the province to invest a certain percentage of your profits into education, specifically for the youth and the risk under 25?
I can speak to the situation in Quebec, where their legislation, Bill 157, actually explicitly sets up the Cannabis Research and Education Fund, which will be a minimum of $25 million a year. Also, as you know, the SAQ has Edu à Cool, which is essentially a tolling process on alcohol producers, which goes into an education program. We have yet to hear if the similar program will be developed for cannabis, but it would not surprise me if that happened, in which case all the producers essentially will be helping to pay for that program. But I just remind you that, of course, the recreational cannabis will be subject to an excise tax, to sales taxes, and so that will generate significant resources for all levels of government to deal with this issue. I think we're all in this together. It's a shared responsibility between industry and governments. In Colorado, in the last 2 years, over $230 million went towards education, either constructing schools or education programs. In fact, the revenue from taxes from cannabis in Colorado now exceeds that from alcohol. So it does fund a lot of important social programs, and I suspect that we will find, when the market matures, that will happen in Canada after a number of years.
I don't have the precise details for each province, but each of them do have an included in the wholesale transfer price to some extent a contemplated single-digit portion, which would be at the discretion, to my knowledge.
Okay, and that will only come into play once the legislation becomes legal. Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Dean.
We have big producers with us. We speculate a lot here about what's happening and not happening, what will happen, what won't happen. Tell us about what you're selling today tell us about the nature of the adult medical market. What are people buying? What's the range like? And is that any indicator of what we might see in the recreational market if it is legalised and regulated? But tell us what the demand side of this looks like.
I can say that when Hydropothecary first started, we were almost exclusively selling our patients flour product. And so most of it was smoked product. With time, with innovation, we developed two products that have become very popular. One is a milled, dried, decarboxylated powder. As you probably know, cannabis, if you took a cannabis bud and ate it, you would not feel anything from it. It has to be activated by removing a carboxyl group, and that usually is why people smoke it, because the heat will do that. We have developed a proprietary process to do that ahead of time, and so people can use it in an ingestible form. That has become very popular, and particularly in lower doses. So that people will actually microdose to manage their symptoms, and they're not using huge quantities. The other products that have been very popular is sublingual spray, our elixir spray. We've had a THC product on the market for about a year, and you spray it under your tongue. For a medical patient, this is very convenient, very discreet. There is some absorption across the mucous membrane, but some obviously that is swallowed and absorbed that way. And again, that provides people with a non-smoked option. We came out with a CBD, high CBD, that is not giving you that euphoric high, but reduces inflammation, reduces pain. And in the last 2 months, that has become one of our best-selling products among our patients, because they're not looking to get high, they're looking to manage their symptoms. And I think if you look, we were down in Seattle and down in Portland and saw the whole gamut of different products there. But I think people will self-select where they want to be, and that will vary in age, in social demographics, in managing their symptoms. I think a lot of people, baby boomers in particular, will use cannabis as a wellness product, not to get high, although maybe the odd weekend they might use it in that way. But I think people will be using it to manage life and reducing inflammation, being able to still play soccer at 60 years old, for instance, with CBD.
So in our world, we've been producing and selling cannabis for 4 years. And 4 years ago, we were only permitted to sell dried cannabis. But if you became a patient today, you're about 50-50 likely to buy it in an oil format. And we're restricted in the oil formats because for everything in cannabis, there is a rule. So our cannabis needs to be sort of bulked up with an adjacent agent like a MCT or a sunflower oil typically, and sold similar strength to the plant. So even in that format, it's about half of our business, or could be, for anybody who's just come on as a patient. Interestingly, over 4 years, the average purchase for a medical patient has been 1.2 grams per day for that entire time. Hasn't gone up, hasn't gone down. So that's been a fairly interesting constant. The average price per gram for which the product sells increases as you migrate to those products. So our average price has gone from a price 3 or 4 years ago of about $7.35 a gram to about $1 higher now. And clearly, if you treat the flour as an ingredient and you process it into the next finished formats and you start to apply technologies to make it more approachable, then the price will go up. Where it's going to go down in medical is we're working diligently. We're in a phase 2B clinical trial we're pursuing. These will become things which are covered by insurance. And again, then that will change the whole price equation. But I think you'll find that most of the companies in the sector who've been working over the last 4 years have been doubling their revenues every year, and substantial growth.
Okay, that's it. Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to get back, Mr. Linton, you, in your opening remarks, I believe, or maybe to one of the answers earlier, you talked about the 200 inspections that your company has received. I just wonder about the inspection process. Is it a random process? How many times do they go into your facilities? Is it different in different places? Maybe just give us some idea of the inspection process.
So there's been an evolution. The frequency has decreased because if you show that you're a risk-rated, unlikely offender, they less frequently show up. But what will happen is, on an unannounced basis, a Health Canada inspector or inspectors arrive. They present you with the identification that includes a badge to say who they are, and they pick a theme. they may say, can I see the video from 2 months ago for the Tuesday in which the plants went in that room? And they observe who was moving them, how many plants went in, and then they ask you to show the files that relate to the individual codes related to those plants, and then they want to see the resulting product and whether or not that total number of plants that went in that room 2 months ago turned into product today. Or they may go through and look at the cameras and say, we saw 3 people on camera. On the time stamp on the cameras, it said that it was 11:12 a.m., and you only wrote down 2. Now you have a problem. So it goes from physical transit of people to plants and production to shrinkage ratios. They look at medical registration forms and make sure that everything's been absolutely done in compliance. Have you verified the doctor? Have you verified the address? So I would say that they take a range of thematics, absolutely random, and as a taxpayer and a person participating in a sector I want to see arrive, I don't actually shudder when I see them. I actually think this is part of the good process.
And in your plans for Newfoundland and Labrador now, and you mentioned that the fact of maybe 150 jobs, what's the process that your company goes through to hire these people, the training that's provided, the background checks, and so on and so forth? Just to
Well, the reason it works in a place like Smiths Falls, and I've been to visioning sessions at First Nations communities where you spend Friday night in a context visioning, is there's a lot of hand-on-hand training. And so if you're going to work with the plants, we don't need you to be an expert at the plant. In fact, that's a liability because you probably got a lot of expertise from the wrong place. So we do hand-on-hand training. We have standard operating procedures which people need to follow, and even for customer care. So the people who answer the phones have a 2-week training program. We've been running a customer care call center for 3.5 years, and we've had 2 people quit. We have about 125 people working in it. So what you'll find is that the effect of the jobs is when a province announces a higher average base minimum salary, it's never affected us because we pay over it. And the standard operating procedures give people a robust training.
And in your the education programs, especially geared towards our youth, from your company's perspective, what's your involvement with that? How much? And I don't necessarily mean just dollar figures as much as hands-on.
So we try not to be hands-on in youth education. We think it's better left to experts and fund it. Where we like to be hands-on is that we've visited on, I believe now we've had more than 40,000 interactions with physicians. And we've had the first, I believe in Canada, certified continuing medical education program. Then when you take that knowledge base of information, a place like New Brunswick is inverting it for the types of questions, answers, and scenarios that a clerk would need to be trained to be appropriately trained at, say, a retail location. And so we're turning that into an online-paced training program, which retail clerks can actually be walked through, and you can determine how they did based on their answers and duration of time participating in the education. And so those are the sorts of things where you see medical turning into retail education.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies, I missed your presentations, but I was actually speaking in the chamber, so that trumped your visit with us. So I'm sorry to have missed, but I've listened intently to my colleagues' questions and your answers. And so I want to pick up on the point that Senator McCollum made around First Nations. And there's a couple of things I want to ask. So first of all, we know that currently the criminalization of cannabis overly criminalizes First Nations and African Canadians and poor people. So I'm wondering, what, if any, efforts is big industry doing to bring those potential people who up to this point have been consumers of what I will call the illicit market. So if they've been consumers of the illicit market, how are they brought into the legal market, not just as consumers, but as producers, as employees? I've not seen any of that. So are any of you aware of any initiatives? Do any of your organizations have any initiatives that address that significant social issue?
I certainly know that, first of all, we have to follow the law, and each province will design the entrance for people into the retail side of the marketplace. But if you look at Manitoba, for instance, they made First Nations participation mandatory for retail opportunities. I know that in my home province of British Columbia that they are very cognizant of First Nations issues and looking for ways of people that have been in the illicit market before, because as any of you who have been to Vancouver know, there is a huge illegal market going on at the moment. And so all of those people typically would not be allowed entrance into the illicit market. But British Columbia has stated an objective of taking people that have not had violent behavior, that haven't had a level of criminality that we would not want in an illicit market, to allow them into the new regulated market, much like California has done. And I think that is the right thing to do. We have had the Assembly of First Nations delegation come to Hydropothecary, and we are very interested in working with First Nations in terms of economic opportunities around this very new industry. And we do think that it is an opportunity for Indigenous communities to participate, and we look forward to assisting them with that.
Are there any similar initiatives for people of African descent?
So in our shop, if you apply for a job and don't tell us that you've had a little rub with the law, whether with cannabis, that's more of a problem than if you do tell us. And so when you look at our org chart and some of the people behind me, they have been very actively involved in the illicit market, whether it's setting up what was once a Compassion Club type program, and some of the people who carried out the protests who ended up with the criminal charges. So we don't put a gate up based on that. We put up a gate up if you're not truthful and transparent and tell us where you came from. I have not done any, we have no current programs that target any identifiable minority. We have been active on First Nations in that one of our goals has been to establish a presence and production facility in that context. And the challenge hasn't been interest in the First Nations, it's really the land rights and the ability to get capital. Because there's quite a lot of interest in a plant rooted in the earth as a medicine. I found it a very much more receptive community than the average, for sure.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll just provide some further commentary. As I stated earlier, we still do live in a society where some people are treated differently than others, and that's something I think we are all collectively working on. We as an industry have begun having internal dialogue around how we can increase diversity and increase inclusion in our sector, not just related to race, but also related to gender and class and other elements as well, to really build an industry that looks like Canada. And that's what we're trying. We're not there yet. We will get there. And I think the discussion point that we're having collectively would be that individuals who have nonviolent possession of cannabis, which disproportionately affects some communities, there should be some sort of governmental response to allow for those individuals to become more active participants in our sector. We are growing rapidly. We need an inclusive and diverse industry, and we'd like to build it.
Is there a recommendation you would make on that in the
I
context of this bill?
I do not have a formal mandate from my board to make a recommendation on amnesty, but I will say, speaking with members of the cannabis community, yes, absolutely. And I just got corrected by someone who's a member, so yes, we do.
I think in our investor group, I found my first investor who's putting up the first $1 million towards a fund inside our company that will work on how do we take the people who had simple possession and reduce that as a lifetime incident issue. And so we're looking for other people who want to fund that and then run that, but we found our first $1 million.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, that completes my list. And with that, let me thank our panelists, all four of you, for all of your input and answering our questions. We're getting towards the end of our deliberations, our hearings, and we'll be reporting into the Senate next week, and the bill will then be dealt with by the Senate for third reading. But meanwhile, thank you very much again, and I'll recess or pause the meeting, I think is the correct phrase, for just a few moments, and at roughly 5 o'clock we'll start again. And with